We are now going to be moving into our next session. We have both Shana White and Frieda McAlear from the Kapor Center. They're going to be coming to the stage to speak to you about K-12 Equitable CS. That's going to focus on practices, implementation, and a vision for the future. So, welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. We appreciate being here. Thank you to all the organizers who made today happen. So I'll just get us started. I just greeted you in my native language of Inupiaq. My name is Frieda McAlear, as was just mentioned, and I'm with the Kapor Center. Next slide, please. And what we like to do at the start of our presentations, thank you, Shana, is to start with a land acknowledgement to really ground us in the place that we're in. So Atlanta, although I'm not in Atlanta right now, I'm in my kitchen, if you can tell from the blur. Atlanta is forever Cherokee or Tsalagi and Muskogee Creek territories. So Atlanta was home to the villages of the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee tribes before contact. And unfortunately for them, gold was discovered in 1828. And so they were removed a few years later in the Trail of Tears out to present-day Oklahoma. There are, however, Cherokee and Creek people who stayed behind, who didn't leave with their leadership and their tribes, and they are now 3 state-recognized tribes. There's no federally recognized tribes in Georgia now for over a century, but what we have is the Cherokee of Georgia Tribal Council, the Georgia Tribe of Eastern Cherokees, or Sagimogi, and the Lower Muskogee Creek Tribe. Next slide, please. You can support these tribes today, and I left up some links, so hopefully these can be made available to you after the presentation. However, if you'd like to support the descendants of the Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek peoples who remain in Georgia today, there is a way to do that. They, of course, are still trying to get their lands back and restore that relationship with their lands. Next slide, please. And so next slide, please. If we can just have a quick intro of the both of us. As I mentioned, I'm the Senior Research Associate at the Kapor Center. In 2018, with Dr. Allison Scott, I co-founded, and Dr. Kim Scott, the Women of Color in Computing Collaborative. And then in 2019, started Seeding Innovation, or Expanding CS for Native Girls, a project that's now NSF funded through 2025. And I will pass it over to Shana to say a few words about herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shana V. White. I'm the Senior Associate of CS Equity and Justice Initiatives at the Kapor Center. A lot of my programmatic areas that I work with are K-12, teacher professional development, K-12 curriculum development, and also working on some other side projects as far as supporting Frieda's seeding a project as far as helping those teachers with PD. And really excited to be here, and we're excited to share some of the work that we've been doing the past year.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Shana. So, and just to say a few words to set the context for the presentation today and our discussion, what we're looking at is really a multi-century intergenerational struggle for Native and Indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation, and really the human rights of all people. So we're taking the longer term view to set the stage, but of course these struggles for justice and the ways in which we're trying to advocate for ourselves within white supremacist culture and empires really playing out in the headlines every day. And so what you're seeing here is some of, just a curated snapshot of some of the ways in which technology intersects with the fight for racial justice and how it's central to that fight. And so one of the ways that we can see this, especially after the murder of George Floyd just over 2 years ago, is that technology is central to the radicalization of young white men and boys online, really a radicalization against women and people of color and immigrants of all racial backgrounds. And so, this is something that we're seeing, really come to a head in our quote unquote culture wars. We've also seen a huge uptick in the past couple of years of Black women coming forward to tell their stories of harassment and exclusion and unfair disciplinary treatment and actions, separations from these large globally branded tech firms like Google and Pinterest. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. Thank you. And so as our CEO and boss, Dr. Allison Scott, says, technology and computing education is at the center of the fight for racial justice, for equity, and for our nation's future. Next slide, please.
Awesome. I think this is when I take over. Frieda gets to take a little break. Our boss, Dr. Allison Scott, is truly a visionary in this work, not only in the K-12 realm, but just technology in general, as far as the Kapor Center being ahead as far as racial justice and equity in technology and computer science spaces. But in order to be aware of the problem, we have to actually name that problem. And there's extensive data that the Kapor Center, other organizations have collaborated on, developed, just kind of brought together. And so I want to make sure that we're clear on where we are as far as the landscape is, the context of the landscape as it is right now. And then that can kind of help as far as hearing our implementation plans that we have been working on and will continue to work on, so we can take and move this needle a little bit further. So the first slide is going to show you basically, as we all should be aware of, access to computer science courses are still inequitably distributed by income and race. So we have to realize that there's an intersectionality piece to a lot of the things that we are dealing with in society as far as inequity is concerned. But the two biggest determinants are going to be race and income status. So we have to understand that those two, as far as classism and racism, are not separate, but we do have to understand that they are separate, but they impact multiple groups across the country in lots of different ways. Then this chart right here shows the participation in APCSP and APCSA, and you see the graph front. The bar at the top is white. So you see on both the graph on the left and the right, the bar at the top shows that white students have an extreme difference as far as a lot of participation in both APCSA and APCSP. And then you see the graph as it goes down, just the big drop off with the other colors. The color that's below the blue is Asian. And then you have Black, Latinx, and Native students. And the thing that I want to bring to the forefront is it wasn't until 2020, Native students weren't even listed on this, which is very egregious and trash, in my opinion. But it shows, again, that we are literally like eliminating an entire demographic and not including them in our data. And if we are really focused on equity, we have to make sure that all historically marginalized groups are included. So making the effort to make sure that we're getting accurate data on our Native populations in the country is important. And so I was glad to see that in 2020, they made that adjustment. But in the past, you would not even see a bar for Native students. But the Native students bar is the very low bottom one. Then also with while greater proportions of Black and Latin and Native students participate in principles, there's still gaps in these courses. So you see that, okay, yeah, there is an increase as far as students that are Black, that are Native, that are Latinx, that are completing computer science principles now, but there's still a huge gap also with as you'll see on the next slide, with scores, et cetera. But basically we see the participation, yeah, we see that trending upward, but really you have to remember where we started and how big that gap was. And we still have a long way to go. All right, and so the other thing that we did is we felt like it was important to not only understand just the student landscape of teachers, but the Kapor Center in collaboration with CSTA completed a teacher landscape, because they are also in the classroom and they are also determinants for equity issues in the classrooms, how those issues get moved forward, how students are successful in CS classrooms, how CS is broadened in districts, in schools, et cetera. And so this report was very insightful to let us know where all the teachers are, what their experience level was, what things they feel are important to a CS classroom, so that this can be a guidepost for all the people that do any type of teacher PD and teacher training. So we can see that there are gaps in understandings of things that are important, and that making sure we narrow those gaps for teachers so that they can better reach Black, Native, and Latinx students is important for our aims to improve equity in CS. So the demographic backgrounds pretty much mirror the demographic backgrounds of American teachers, predominantly white women. And so that demographic, as you'll see as a future slide will show, has different priorities in some cases for what they think is important in a CS classroom, what they feel are important issues that should be addressed and talked about, and brought into the CS community, and wrestled with and figured out ways that they can be mitigated to stop harm to certain communities that have been harmed by technology. You see that the distribution of years of experience, most of the teachers are only 1 to 4 years. So not only are we having them teach a subject that is complex and considered rigorous by standards, but a lot of them don't have extensive experience in teaching that subject area. So not only do we want to make sure that teachers are having affirming classrooms that are culturally responsive, anti-racist, and social justice centered, but also we know that they don't know CS as innately or deeply as they possibly could, which is going to impact their comfort level in the classroom. And I think, especially with COVID, knowing how terrible teachers have always been treated. I came out of the classroom last year. Just to know that, like, we're throwing a lot of stuff on teachers' plates. And some of that stuff, a lot of that stuff should now shift and should have been shifted to a lot of the people that are making money off of these things, curriculum providers, other external organizations, even like the Kapor Center. How are we supposed to be stepping in to narrow these gaps to make sure that teachers are equipped to not only understand the content of computer science that they're teaching, but understand how to relate better to students that are Black, Brown, students with disabilities, students that are English language learners, et cetera, those marginalized groups that have been excluded from CS over the years. How do we bridge the gap to have more of those students in these classrooms? And then this is the staggering stat about culturally relevant teaching, usages and talent challenges. Basically, 65% believe existing curricular resources meets the needs of a diverse student body. So if we know the context right now in our public schools, most of our public schools are Black and Brown students, and predominantly, again, as we saw in the previous graph, taught by white women. We have to understand that kind of understanding of what is curricular resources that are going to meet a diverse body is going to be a little jaded, because we don't know where all white women are, or the majority of white women that are teaching CS, their mindset as far as like, what is the diverse student population? What cultures am I having to see and bring in my classroom? What cultures am I making sure that are being affirmed? Student identities that are being affirmed. So only 65 believe that existing curricular resources meet needs of the students. And so if we're trying to bring Black and Brown and Native and students with disabilities and English language learners and LGBTQ community members into our CS classrooms as students, we have to make sure the curriculum is going to meet their needs, and it's going to be something that they can identify with, that they can learn from, that is not going to harm or hurt them. We have a lot of curriculum in the country, a lot of the fight with CRT bans, which we all know CRT has never been taught in the K-12 level. But we have this kind of rhetoric of you can't teach kids about race. And I know that there's some legislation going through at Georgia is about this kind of idea that you can't teach kids what actually historically did happen. But that is part of the reason that we need to push the envelope in CS to talk about these issues, talk about these things, bring social justice and racial justice issues into a computer science classroom, because we're also going to not only help students identify with CS, feel comfortable, affirmed in a CS classroom, but also possibly help them mitigate some of the harms that their communities, their identities are being hampered with technology now. Only 61% of teachers believe topics of inequity should be covered in class. So that's a very alarming statistic. Please understand that our educational system, like most institutions in the United States, is built on the premise of white supremacy. So if you do not fall in the demographic that white supremacy has as far as white people being at the top of the hierarchy, cis het people being at the top of the hierarchy, able-bodied people being at the top of the hierarchy, males being at the top of the hierarchy. All those kind of identifying demographics are considered the top of the hierarchy, and everybody else is just kind of good luck, pushed to the margins. Think we just kind of hope for the best for you. And so the fact that we're thinking that these topics are not important, they're the bedrock of educational system. Our educational system was built on white supremacy, which is ultimately founded in an idea of inequity, that one group is superior over another. And so for teachers to not think that that's an important thing that needs to be discussed is kind of alarming, especially because, as we talked about before, the demographics of the teachers, and then we know the demographics of the students that we're serving are completely different. And so how do we get that sense of urgency in our teachers to understand that we do have to address these inequities? We can't be colorblind, as you might hear people say, or just not talk about it and think it's going to go away. Anytime you have some big systemic, institutional, interpersonal issue like racism, classism, sexism, you have to address that thing in the room. A lot of people think about it as an elephant in the room that we can't talk about, but when you don't talk about it, you make things worse. So addressing that thing in the room is really important. 55% of teachers have to revise existing curricula. So that means our curriculum providers are not doing what they're supposed to do to make the curriculum culture relevant. So teachers are taking as little paid as they are, as little extra time they have, trying to do right by students and adjust curricula, whereas curriculum providers that are making tons of money in the CS community are not doing more of the heavy lifting as far as making curriculum culturally relevant for students of different backgrounds and cultures. 55% feel equipped to utilize culturally relevant teaching practices. And the greatest support for our CS teachers is needed for elementary, for our early career CS teachers, and for our white teachers in understanding culturally relevant CS teaching and usage. So what we did at the Kapor Center last year is we want to kind of push the envelope as far as we know that there's tons of scholarship on culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogy, culture sustaining pedagogy, and Frieda will introduce you to some of the pedagogy that they're using with some of her Native girls in Native schools in Stillwell a little bit later. But we realize that this has got to be moved into CS education. CS has always felt that it's kind of like an apolitical subject. You can't necessarily, you don't have to talk about race, you don't have to talk about inequity, et cetera. None of that is applicable to computer science because we just work with computers. But we have to understand, as one of the Constellation Fellows told me years ago, Terry Foster, he said, and he told students, he said, computers are not smart. And so we as humans, we tell the computers what to do. And so computers don't do anything unless a human tells it what to do. They don't operate on their own. Even with machine learning and AI, they are programmed to learn based on what they have been taught as far as algorithms, et cetera. So understanding that, we have to get to the root of the problem, which is the human aspect of computer science, and understand we have to engage in anti-racist, culture responsive practices moving forward if we are going to move the needle for equity. So we developed a culture responsive sustaining framework. I thought I saw it posted in a couple of other sessions that I've seen before, but this is freely available on our website. And I'm guessing somebody from the Constellation staff will post it in the chat right now. But it has two big things. We want to make sure that we put a stake in the ground as saying, we have a definition of what culture responsive sustaining computer science education is. We've heard about culture responsive, culture sustaining, and culturally relevant, but we as a CS community have never really defined it. So what we did is we developed a definition, and then we developed and articulated 6 core components of what we think culture responsive teaching in a CS classroom should look like. And there's very many facets that I'll talk about on the next slide. So here's the definition for culture responsive sustaining computer science, and I'll leave the slide up for a second for y'all to read. So a lot of the things we based our definition of culture responsive sustaining computer science on the scholarship of Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, Dr. Geneva Gay, Django Paris. all the people, Zaretta Hammond, all the people that have been in the forefront of this work for years and years and years. And we took that and tweaked it so that it was applicable to computer science, because a lot of times, as I mentioned before, people believe that computer science is not a political subject, but teaching in general is always going to be political. Political means you actually work with people and the government. So if you work in a school building, you work with people and you work for the government. So teaching is always going to be political, and computer science is not immune to that. But culture responsive sustaining computer science pedagogy ensures that students' interests, identities, and cultures are embraced and validated. That's a really huge thing. Embraced and validated, not just, hey, we did a Black History Month celebration, or hey, it's like AAPI month, so we'll pretend like we care about AAPI students. But their cultures are embraced and validated from day one in the classroom. Students develop knowledge of computing content and its utility in the world. Strong CS identities are developed so that students actually see identities or people that share identity characteristics that they have in computer science. So they can sit there and say, I can identify with this person. This person has the same background as me. Maybe this person has the same gender identity. Maybe this person has the same sexual orientation. Maybe this person has the same disability, whatever the case may be, that they can see themselves in CS because there's other people that are like them in CS. And they develop that strong confidence and self-efficacy in CS because the teacher has affirmed and validated who they are, all the identities that they bring to the table, both the visible and the invisible ones. And then you sit there and you develop their confidence in CS by developing those strong CS identities. And then students engage in larger sociopolitical critiques about technology's purpose, potential, and impact. So this is the part where we're talking about the political things, is that we have to have students engaging in sociopolitical critiques. That's one of the big things that Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about all the time, is that part of culturally relevant pedagogy is making sure that we understand that the system is inequitable and that we equip students to disrupt the status quo. That is what we're supposed to do if we are being culturally relevant as far as teachers. So making sure that we have kids and we are engaging in those critiques of what is going on in the world, how is this impacting certain people, how can I be a better ally or accomplice for these things, and all these things moving forward. A lot of times people want to shy away from these things, but these are things that are impacting our students. So they have to be discussed and brought into the classroom. And then the 6 core components, the first one is my favorite, which everybody laughs at when I say, but it is just because I love the fact that Dr. Scott allowed us to put a stake in the ground. And we said that we need to acknowledge racism and enact anti-racist practices. We actually say the words white supremacy in our framework, which gives a little few people pause, but ultimately, as I said before, you have to name that elephant in the room, and white supremacy has been in our educational institution since its inception. Number 2 is create inclusive, equitable classroom cultures. Number 3 is the pedagogy and the curriculum are rigorous, relevant, and encourage student sociopolitical critiques. Number 4, big one, is student agency and voice. So it's not just saying we care about student voice, but students actually drive and direct the classroom, that it's a classroom community. It's not something that's just led by the teacher and everybody does what the teacher says, but the students get to drive how things go. And our teachers learn how to adapt, as we'll talk about a little bit later with the schools we're working with. What are the students interested in? They're comfortable enough in the classroom to share what those interests are. And I know what the CS standards are. So it's my job as a teacher to work lessons around those things that they are interested in. Number 5 is another big one, making sure that we don't have deficit mindsets about the families and caretakers that our students are coming from. So making sure we're including them in the process of this building the CS community in our classrooms. And then the last one is diverse professionals and role models provided for students. So it's not just diverse as far as identity characteristics, race, ethnicity, gender, but also different pathways. We know tech has so many unique pathways to get into. It's not just a one pathway, one-stop shop. You don't have to finish high school and go to college and then get a graduate degree and get a degree. There's so many people that have gotten to tech in high school, kids that have entrepreneurial spirit. How do we direct them and let them use tech and leverage tech to do the things that they want to do? And then last, I wanted to share our definition of what equitable computer science education. Again, like I said, naming with explicit definitions is always important. And so at the Kapor Center, we believe historically marginalized students should receive both opportunity and access to quality CS education. that they experience success in CS classrooms. That's a really important part of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy, is that kids experience success, academic success in the classroom, and then that kids are affirmed and cared for in CS classrooms. And that's from Dr. Geneva Gay, that we want to care for kids. We don't want to care about. Care about is passive. Care for is an active act. So we care about. Caring about is just going to be that passive, like, yeah, I care that my students are in my classroom. Caring for is making sure that I'm really engaged with who they are as human beings. Student agency and leadership, as well as community voice, are encouraged and present in classrooms. Teachers in schools are equipped with resources and training to deliver quality CS education. That's part of our job at the Kapor Center, is we're trying to reach as many teachers as we can in schools with resources and equipment, and just learning how to be the best computer science teachers that they can be. And then CS classrooms educate and support all students to disrupt racism, inequity, and other systemic barriers. And I'll turn it back over to Frieda.
Such an easy act to follow, Shana. Such an easy act to follow. Thank you so much for all of the context and the framework information that you shared. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the through lines of my project, building off of the work that was done in the framework, and then all of the other work that's going on in Native communities to really restore our relationships to our land, to get our land back and reclaim that. We started, talking about this intergenerational and multi-century struggle. And for Native folks, this is really about our lands, getting back into right relationship with our land. So I wanted to start in a good way by just honoring the work of rematriation that's been happening in different areas of our territories on Turtle Island. What is rematriation? So, it's restoring a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship with their ancestral lands. And so when we think about that, what does that really mean? It's not just getting the land back. Often what we find when we get our lands back is that they've been degraded. They've been mined. There's extensive water waste. There's, non-drinkable water. There's uranium, pieces left over, it's irradiated. I mean, there's literally, anything that you could have imagined from atomic bombs being dropped in New Mexico and Arizona to having, egregious tailing pond waste, killing all the local wildlife and birds. All of that's happened on our territories and continues to happen. And so what rematriation is about is restoring that right relationship to stewardship of our lands. And what that does, and why this is the context for my project work, is it really centers women and queer, trans, two-spirit people in their right relationship within our tribes. It restores some of that gender balance that colonization has really disrupted, not just in tech, but in all throughout society. So we are the life bringers, the creators of life, the nurturers of that life. And you can really see this work happening in different tribal territories, including in Georgia with, housing and languages coming back to us, our culture and ceremonies, our artwork, our craft work, our weaving, our beadwork coming back, the ways that we're adapting to the changing climate, not just restoring right relationship to our land as they were, but lands as they're becoming, using our medicines and healing and our traditional knowledges, coming back to us as a way that, we don't have to hide who we are anymore. This was something that a lot of Native folks had to do for generations. Eastern tribes, especially woodlands tribes, some literally went into hiding or intermarried with white families in order to to not be driven out of their lands, or to not be singled out for for particular types of punishments, or just to be able to stay where they were on their homelands. So this rematriation concept is really one of the underpinning theories and philosophical through lines of the project work that I do with Seeding Innovation. Next slide, please. And I couldn't talk about that without talking about Karina Gould. Thank you so much, Shana, who is the spokesperson of the Shana, the people whose lands I'm on today in Oakland, the village site of Huchin. And something that she said that I wanted to give her a shout out in this. Whenever I talk about rematriation, I talk about her because of her work here in her territories. What she tends to say is that's the problem, that men have been in charge of land for so long that this is what's happened to the world. Men have treated women's bodies the same way they treat the lands. And we see tech playing a part in that, of course, with different forms of mining, but also, the ways that technology is used to constrain and limit the choices of women and queer, trans, two-spirit people everywhere. Next slide, please. So seeding innovation is really about trying to restore this right relationship through CS education in Native serving schools. So we have these different curricular goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Stillwell context in a moment, but what we want to do with this project is really give Native girls their culture back through CS, project-based learning. And so this is traditional knowledges, their languages, their values. We really try to infuse the curriculum with culture first, not sort of a module or an add-on, but really our whole scope and sequence is culturally defined. And it's using the tribe's values and their traditional knowledges that we create the curriculum and the project-based learning they do. We also want to give them opportunities to build, their racial identities. As Shana mentioned, this is a critical component in building their confidence in CS and as CS learners. And so really reflecting and mirroring back that not only are their identities okay, they're celebrated, honored, they're the center of the curriculum. That's a big piece of why we're doing what we're doing. We also, through this, again, we're wanting to support the tribe's broader goals. Oftentimes education was an exclusionary practice, and it still is in a lot of ways, as Shana mentioned. But for Native people especially, there was this concept, with Native boarding schools that started in the 1800s, late 1700s. You kill the Indian, save the man. There were these really violent ways that Native youth were indoctrinated and assimilated into white supremacist culture. And so we're really trying to undo some of that erasure. We're trying to undo some of this harm that's been done intergenerationally. And when we think about that, of course, these boarding schools started, centuries ago, but a lot of them are still operating. They're more tribally controlled now. But my own mother, for example, I talk about this sometimes, was a boarding school survivor. So this is not, deep history or anything. There are still Native students going into these boarding schools, even if they're tribally controlled. The histories there are very harmful to us as people. And so we're really trying to affirm and build this awareness of Indigenous innovation, technology, and the sciences at the same time. We didn't really just start innovating things once there was colonization. Of course, we had to innovate quite a lot in order to be successful and thrive in our territories, and also help our territories thrive themselves. To be part of the flourishing of our lands, and so that requires quite a bit of innovation. So we're reinstilling this idea that we're not starting from zero. Native girls are really reclaiming back a lot of their traditional knowledges, which are innovative, and that's always been with them and their ancestors. Next slide, please. So I'm just giving you a little snapshot of a lesson. So this is work that we're doing specifically with Stillwell. All of our school partners have different they're in different tribal territories. And so, we really respond to the tribe-specific context, and in some cases, really that community-specific context. Because with larger tribes, what you'll tend to see is that it really comes down to the community, what the culture is, and how they practice their language and traditional knowledges. So we're out here in Stillwell, Oklahoma. We've been there for 2 years. This is a small community out in eastern Oklahoma, near the border with Arkansas. And so this is Cherokee Nation lands. We talked earlier about the Cherokee tribe, the Creek and Cherokee tribes being out in Georgia. And that was really the start of the Trail of Tears. The end of the Trail of Tears is not far from Stillwell. It's about 20 miles out of Stillwell in eastern Oklahoma. And so there's this real kind of bracketing I'm giving you of some of the Cherokee story today, although there's so much more history to learn. I really encourage you to dig in if you're interested. There's so much of America's history in what happened to the Cherokee, Creek, Muskogee, all the 5 tribes that are located in Oklahoma now today. So what we're doing here is really talking about how we can figure out a girl-focused cultural revitalization lesson. So it's not just cultural revitalization in general, which might include things, like different types of regalia that they might use, or their different ways of being on the land, including hunting and gathering of herbs and cultivation of plants. But this is actually just focused on some of the things that girls might learn in their tribal context, something that helps, again, build their nation back, bring skills back into their tribal communities that they're interested in maintaining and continuing on for future generations. So beading is a big deal because in part it's a communication strategy for Native peoples, and it's a way in which we like to honor the things that have happened in our lives. It's a way that we communicate in some ways our tribal roles, whether that's to do with hunting. You know, again, this is this beadwork pattern that you see there is buffalo tracks. You know, so that might be an interesting beadwork pattern for somebody's regalia to honor buffalo. So you know, you have these different patterns. They have different meanings. But again, they're part of our cultural strategy as people to say who we are to each other and to say what we've gone through and what's important to us. So beadwork is a really important thing that we wanted to share. And this particular lesson that I've given you a snapshot of is using these 8x32 LED strips with Arduinos. And so you can take these LED strips and you can create beadwork patterns using them and teach the cultural significance and the history of beading, the modern uses and traditional uses of beading to all students. And it's something that really brings, again, the attention of the girls and also their interest alongside computer science. All right, next slide, please. So what would make rematriating CS education look like? You know, this is something that I think about a lot. Because it impacts my life as a Native woman, but also, you know, what I'm trying to do in this project, how we're trying to bring back these knowledges and bring back our right relationship with the land. Doing that with CS education might look like understanding that there are lots of different relationships of the people and the non-living beings and all of the living beings and non-living beings in the production and use of technology. This is certainly an indigenous holistic view, right? I mean, this is how we sort of think about, you know, what is really happening when we use these things, you know, these things in our hands, the phones that we're always on, or our laptops, you know, what are the quality and strength of those relationships that went into producing that? You know, were all of the people involved, the non-living beings involved in that process, were they respected? Were they able to freely choose what they were doing? You know, where was consent given? You know, these are kinds of things that we think about, especially with the long histories of technology and its use in empire and colonization. So those are some of the things that we think about. You know, again, it's looking at the whole system and whether or not these are these kinds of relationships are understood and held in sanctity, you know, if they're held sacred. So that's a little bit of what I wanted to share with you today about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. But of course, there's so much more to talk about. So I will hand it back to Shana. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm always in awe of hearing what's going on in Stillwell, and like so super happy that this past year I actually got to work with two of the teachers in Stillwell just on instructional strategies. Like, we try to stay away from CS. Like, one of the teachers is brand new to teaching, has never gone through a teaching program. So we were working on like, how do you build a classroom community? Like, what are some ways to get kids engaged in the classroom? Those types of things. So I'm always in awe of what is happening in Stillwell, and I'm excited for this next year coming up with more impact there. The other project that we are working on at Kapor Center, me specifically, is we're reaching out to districts in Georgia and working with them with implementing K-12 computer science education. So shout out to Brian Cox. I would say right when I got started at the Kapor Center, I sent him an email and I was like, what districts like have received the 25K grant that don't know what direction to go, what to do, et cetera. And he sent me a very long list. And Early County, Terrell and Early County were the two that reached out to me immediately, because at first I think they thought like it was a scam. Like, why is this lady offering free help to us, type of thing. But we partnered with Early County. We're in a partnership with them for the next 4 years. It is in South Georgia, right at the border of Alabama and Georgia. I've made that 3.5-hour drive from Metro Atlanta one way. It's a very unique drive. You get to see all of Georgia, but it is very rural down in Blakely. They only have 10,000 people that live in the county of Early. The composition, as far as racially, it's predominantly Black or multiple race people. And then white is going to be also the other demographic. Most of the students are on free and reduced lunch. At the school, there's only about 2,000 students, and that's elementary, middle, and high school. They only have 3 schools in their district. I work with the director of CTAE, Dr. Richardson, and the two teachers. We have a middle school and a high school teacher that are currently going through their RESA certification right now, so they can be certified CS teachers in the process. We just completed our first year. We had 22 students total in the classes taking CS. We had an IDT right before it phased out, because we know IDT phases out this year. We had 8th graders, 16 of them taking an IDT course, and then we had 6 high school students taking that same IDT course. So the teachers got to work together on planning and curriculum. They use the Code HS curriculum for teaching that curriculum. Next year, we're going to have all of those students move into computer science principals together. And then we have one student who is the principal's, the middle school principal's son. He has been taking classes through Georgia Virtual. And so he's actually going to take APCSA through Georgia Virtual this fall as well. And then we eventually are going to expand down to elementary school, but we're trying to get middle and high school pretty much set up and flowing and everybody comfortable there. And then we're going to, of course, progress down to elementary school. The goal is after year 4 is to basically make sure that they have a thriving CS program where K through 12 kids are exposed to computer science. The teachers are equipped to be able to teach computer science, and the students have access to resources and anything else that they need. And the other big thing that is important to the Kapor Center, I know to me and also to Frieda, is that we don't like to helicopter into situations. So it was a big ask because I mentioned to my boss how far away it was, but I was like, it's really important for me to go to Blakely and build community with people in Early County. So there have been several meetings where I've been to Blakely during COVID in person. So I met the superintendent, I met families, I met some of the kids' parents. I've met all of the students multiple times. They've met with me virtually when they had questions, those types of stuff. So it's really a community. So the kids and the parents and the caregivers and administrators, when they see me, they know who I am. It's not like, who is this lady coming in the building? I'm a part of the Early County community, which I think is really important for any type of process where you're wanting to build equitable computer science. So here's some pictures of our CS night. It's the first one they've ever had. We had students creating projects of their interest level. We had kids create video games, kids do mods in Minecraft. We had kids basically readjust because they were big Madden fans. They basically went in and manipulated some of the Madden game for different players to play different positions to see if they could beat them. Like they had races in Madden, almost like a little training camp to see if certain players from certain teams could beat certain people. They also used Arduinos to light up whenever like a touchdown was scored, a certain light would light up. If a penalty happened, like a red light would light up, those types of things. So lots of really unique projects, things that they were interested in doing that they did. And you see in that picture right here, that's my boss, Dr. Scott. She and I drove down there to visit in person. We actually got it catered. So we basically made a meal, like a whole night out of it. The superintendent was there, all the principals, etc. And this is a picture of the first day that I met the middle school class. The first day I came down there and they were just kind of like, why are you like caring about Blakely? And I was like, there are people that care about all areas. And I think it's really important to show you care by making sure that you're there in person, that you're developing relationships with the students, that you're getting to know the teachers and supporting them. And here's some more pictures of things that we did. We had them actually zoom in with a Googler. This is Ernest Holmes, and he works for Google in Atlanta. He's a graduate of Morehouse. I think Codehouse is here or was here yesterday, etc. And Ernest is brilliant and amazing. And I got him to zoom in with our students so they could actually meet somebody who works at Google, because the perspective of Early County is kind of, I just stay in Early County, I go to school here and I don't leave. And showing them that there are other opportunities. We're going to take field trips if COVID cooperates this coming fall, where we're going to bring them up to Georgia Tech, see college campuses and see the Google campus and the Microsoft campus in the city, so they can see just the possibilities of things. But letting these students know that like There are people that care about their success in CS. There are people that just care about them as a community. And then the other big thing that we do, and I know Frieda is also trying to do with her schools as well, is more wraparound services. How can we help parents? And Kapor Center has a lot of organizations that we work with that work on tech readiness, that work on upping your tech skills and those types of things. So giving those things as those virtual classes to parents or caregivers that are interested free of cost. So if they want to up their skills so that they can maybe apply for a different job, we have connections. And that's the other thing that we're implementing starting this fall, where we're going to have kind of like a night school for all parents and caregivers. Anybody that wants to take technology classes through some of the companies that Kapor Center works with, they can do that as well. So as I said, it's a community process. It's not just we're just coming in the schools and we don't care. We're literally not helicoptering in. We're being a part of the Early County community, and we'll be a part of that community for several years. And so that's the end of our slides. And I wanted to allow time for any questions or comments from anybody in the session. Before we go, if you have questions specifically about Frieda's program or mine, or anything about anything else, we do work with, like we've kind of put a feeler out for districts that want to work with us. Our big thing, because our organization is centered on racial justice, is we want to work with districts that have high either Native, Black, or Latinx populations. So that must be the majority of the student body, or majority of maybe the teacher body that is engaging in CS. That is something that's important to us in order to move the needle. We feel like we have to be involved with the communities that we want to serve, to make things more equitable for them. So the school districts that we work with, like I said, have varied. This next year, we're going to be working with purpose-built schools. That's in APS. So we're working with their elementary, middle, and high school. And then we will be working with 2 high schools in Muskogee County as well. And then there's a couple other districts, Dooley and Mitchell, that possibly will be working with our high schools as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to connect with us at the Kapor Center in our work. We have teacher PD that we offer, and we give teacher stipends for participating in our PD. We have also things that we're working on with students, where we have students creating lessons out of Northwestern in Chicago. They are actually creating lessons on the intersection of ethics and technology, and they're creating lessons so that they can teach teachers how to teach these lessons to students next year in high schools in Chicago. So there's a lot of different great things that we're working on at the Kapor Center. I know our contact information can be found on the web, but feel free to reach out. But I wanted to open the floor if anybody has any questions specifically that we can answer for you. That means we answered everything, Frieda, so we ain't got to talk no more. Does that mean we get to leave?
I don't see anything else that's new in the chat. I think we ended up answering everything that was asked in real time.
Yes, yeah. I think, you answered Dana's question. And then do we work with Cobb? We can. A lot of districts in Metro Atlanta were a little apprehensive when I came to them because they figured there was a catch. And we're starting a collective impact model in Atlanta, Oakland, and Detroit. So we are willing to work with metro school districts, but because of the size of the districts, we can't offer kind of like the full help like we do with the rural school districts and like purpose-built, because purpose-built is only 3 schools, so we can work with all 3 of those schools. And shout out to Yolanda Payne, who's going to be working with me with the purpose-built schools. It's a collaboration between Kapor Center and Constellations, working with them the next 4 years. Can we? Oh yeah, we're developing an entire curriculum repository of lessons, and so the students will be done with their lessons in 2 weeks. They will actually present them at CSTA. They will be a part of our. We have a panel, and we actually are going to have the students come in from the panel and talk about their projects then. But it'll be a part of a repository that's free of charge for all teachers, and a lot of other cool stuff like instructional strategies for CS, et cetera, that are coming down the pipeline in August. The students that created the lessons were high school students, and they worked with post-grad students of Dr. Sapir Vakil at Northwestern. And they're all in Chicago. I think we're going to send a PDF of the slides to Lynn.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll send a PDF of the slides to Lynn, and she'll make sure y'all get them.
This has been so much fun. Thank you to all the organizers for today's event. We really appreciate all of your hard work. Thank you so much, Shana, for driving the slides and pulling me in.
And now we're done. Yay.